Um, I wanted to give you kind of to start just a little bit of background information on PROergonomics. My name is Sarah Snable, and I'll be a presenter today. I'm one of the partners at PROergonomics, and PROergonomics, we are a consulting company and training. Those are kind of our specialties, and we focus very specifically on ergonomics. So there are 3 partners at PROergonomics. We are all certified professional ergonomists, which means that we have an education background in kinesiology and human factors, and then also a diverse work experience in all aspects of ergonomics that make us eligible for this designation. All of the staff at PROergonomics are registered kinesiologists with the College of Kinesiologists of Ontario, and we are all working towards our professional designation. So we're all in various stages, all the staff are in various stages of achieving that. We really strive to be professionals in all that we do, so we put a strong effort in using our teamwork to help develop customized solutions for our clients. And all of us have kind of different niches and work backgrounds, so we will often collaborate with each other and really make sure that our clients are getting the most effective and innovative solutions. So that's just a little bit of kind of background on us. In terms of today, sorry, I'm just trying to advance my slide here. There we go. So as I mentioned, my name is Sarah Snable. I'm one of the partners of PROergonomics, and I'll be presenting today's webinar on frontline staff training. So every month we host a free webinar, and it's always on a different topic related to ergonomics. So we really take pride in providing education on ergonomics and truly believe that this is the most effective way, or a really good way in promoting the ergonomics industry. So I wanted to thank you so much for tuning in today, whether you're a regular attendee or you're joining us for the first time. Welcome, and I'll give you a brief overview of how the webinar is going to work today. So if you are listening in, you're welcome to just listen. If you wanted to ask questions or anything like that, there is a chat panel, or I think a little question bar on the right side of your screen, and you can ask questions that way. You can also, I think you have the option where you can put up your hand, right? That will flag my attention as well. In case you're having any issues with sound or something is choppy, that would just be a note to me to make sure that I'm right in front of my microphone here. If you are having any other kind of issues, like the sound is choppy, also note that you might be able to call in. If you're listening with your computer speakers, you can also call in to a Toronto phone number, and that might help with any sound clarity or the choppiness. And on that note, let's talk about today's webinar. So the agenda today is short and sweet. We are going to talk about goals and objectives when we're talking about doing frontline staff training. What is your expected outcome? And then also, what kind of content should you cover? And then the things that you should think about when you're delivering ergonomics training in terms of, your group size, where should you host it, all the bits and pieces that would make a training session truly engaging for your frontline staff. So again, short and sweet kind of agenda, 3 steps. So before you take on a training initiative for your staff, really you should be thinking about what you're trying to achieve. What is it that you would like the staff to get out of the training? Right, so perhaps your first thought is that you want to provide them with some general knowledge on ergonomics so that they know what it is. Right? What is ergonomics? Those basic ergonomic principles, how ergonomics might help them to be safer in the work that they're doing. Educate them to know that ergonomics is a branch of health and safety that's looking at the hazards that can cause injuries, the strains and sprains injuries. Sometimes those are less obvious. The more obvious ones are cutting yourself, getting electrocuted, falling from a ladder. Those are the ones that they're probably super aware of. And the strains and sprains injuries, they're ones that, again, a little less obvious. They may not necessarily be familiar of those, or familiar of how ergonomics can prevent those types of injuries. Perhaps one of the goals in your training is that you want to draw their attention to some new or updated policies or reporting tools, maybe some initiatives related to ergonomics that the company is taking on. Your Joint Health and Safety Committee is going to have a blitz. They're going to be focusing on ergonomics. Maybe you're thinking about forming an ergonomics committee, something like that, where you're wanting to communicate something specific to ergonomics to them. Something we've been seeing in the past few years a lot is orders from the Ministry of Labor related to ergonomics training. So it could be that you have a Ministry of Labor inspector there for another issue, but they do have ergonomists as well, and any of them can write orders for things that they see that they think could be improved by an increased focus on ergonomics. So what we see most often is orders related to having an MSD injury prevention policy or program in place, This means you need to get your ducks in a row with respect to your paperwork and your policies, kind of that foundation. And they also write orders if they see something that looks hazardous. So they won't necessarily tell you how to fix it, but they'll state and write in their order that you need to have an ergonomic risk assessment done by a qualified individual. So you'll need to identify the hazards and then come up with a plan to address them. And then third, and what we see probably most often, most common, is orders related to having to provide education and training to staff on ergonomics. And that's definitely something that we've seen more commonly in the past year. I think maybe 2 years ago I had a big focus where I did quite a few risk assessments, but more recently it's been training. So not really sure what their focus is right now, but definitely educating staff on ergonomics can be something that may get put on your plate to get in compliance. Or maybe your goal is, maybe you're a bit more advanced, you're looking beyond the basics, beyond the intro. Maybe your goal is to be more targeted, where you're focusing on very specific tasks that frontline staff are doing and educate them on the ideal work methods, like how to set up their vehicle, the seating if we're focusing on driving ergonomics, how to do their tasks in better postures, how or why to use certain tools and equipment, for example, lift assist. So all of these reasons are valid, and we're going to give you some direction today in planning your training session, because it may look a little different for each of you depending on your industry, depending on which group of frontline staff we're talking about, how many different tasks the staff in your organization, like the diversity of the tasks that they do, that for the staff that you call frontline, and then also depending on your current state of ergonomics awareness in your company. So are you starting from scratch, or are you a little more advanced in your ergonomic initiatives and you're looking to really hone in on some specifics? So I want you to think about who your frontline staff are. So you may have several different groups or types of frontline staff at your company. So you want to take into consideration how to effectively deliver ergonomics training to engage them. Can or should you do the same session or the same content for everyone? Or are you going to think about doing some customized sessions, some customized sections of the training at least? So for example, when I think of customer service, I most often think of staff working at a desk or a computer, either interacting with customers over the phone or maybe in person at a counter. And so although I think there are some basic ergonomic principles that I think can be constants in a training session, like principles that everyone will benefit from learning, the specific examples that you would use and the strategies used in a training session to really make it hit home to them and make it engaging are likely going to be a little different than if you were doing training for somebody, if we're talking about that office setting, and then comparing it to production staff on an assembly line or the housekeeping staff. It would be a waste of time for your production and housekeeping staff to sit and listen to you talk about computer hazards when that's such a minimal component of their job. So just some different things to keep in mind is kind of make a list or identify your frontline staff and in general, what are some of the main hazards, right? Because you might be able to group them differently. The main concept that you're going to want to get across, though, to all of your frontline staff is, how does ergonomics apply to me? So to them specifically, to them as the frontline staff. How will ergonomics help me do my job better, to do my job safer? What is it about ergonomics that will help me, right? You need to make sure that they can understand how it's going to apply to them. All too often I see, I go out into a maintenance or a, go out in a field in like a roads crew, for example, and I think, oh, ergonomics can't help me. My job is the way that it is. So, there are always ways that we need to think about, tailoring and customizing those sessions to make it hit home for everybody. So for these reasons, I strongly suggest that you consider your training sessions to be focused for the different types of frontline staff you have, and then have it customized to their specific needs. So, of course, you're going to have some basic principles that should be covered in a training session, regardless of the group, whether you're talking about your customer service office type staff or your production staff, and that's going to help to build that solid foundation. So for today, we're going to talk about those first. And then what I'll do for the next half is talk about the ways that you might want to customize delivery of your training sessions for the different frontline staff. So in general, the kind of overall focus really is giving them a foundation on the basics of ergonomics. You want to be able to show them or explain to them, convey to them, teach them how to identify MSD hazards for their job, right? If we're talking about giving training to an ergonomics committee or a joint health and safety committee where they might be identifying hazards, across the entire facility, the entire plant, then that's kind of a different aspect of training. But if we're talking about frontline staff training, we're talking how to identify hazards in the jobs that they do for them specifically, and how the work methods that they might choose to do can impact their injury risk, either increase it or decrease it. And really the focus should be on ways that they can manage those hazards that are within their control. Right, so the idea is not to have a training session to highlight all of the gaps or all of the problems, or to come up with all these big ideas like we should automate this and we need a lift assist here. And the part of this training really should be to focus on that idea of working smarter, not harder. So what can you utilize that you already have? Sometimes it might be using a tool that's not really used often. So making sure we go through the steps on how to use it effectively and why we would use it. And it could be about doing things in a different posture or with a different technique. But really focusing on how they can manage hazards themselves. What is within their own control? And there should be quite a lot, actually. So absolutely, the first thing that you're going to want to cover is explaining ergonomics, right? The definition. So there are some lengthy definitions out there to describe ergonomics. Right? It's the science of how humans interact with a system, whether it be at work, at home, at play. A system being the tasks they perform, the tools and equipment that they might use, the environment that they're in, the methods that are used. All is going to factor into how that human is able to interact with the system with the ultimate goal of reducing injury risk, right? MSD injury risk or musculoskeletal. Improving performance, increasing productivity, efficiency, quality, and so on. So in short, kind of your short and sweet definition here is ergonomics is looking at the way to fit the work to the worker. Each person's a different height, different size, different shape, and yet we might be asked to use the exact same tools or use the same chair, work at the same workbench. It's not practical, nor is it really ethical to suggest that only people who are 5'2" can work at this station on the assembly line, and those who are 6'2" would work at this station on the packaging line, for example. We need to be able to make and look for ways to make adjustments or modifications to the system, right? To the tools, the equipment, the layout, to enable workers of all different sizes to be able to perform the same job tasks and to be able to perform them successfully and with minimal injury risk. And so part of that training really, you're talking about how to identify MSD hazards in their job specifically. So, don't forget, you're probably going to want to explain what is an MSD. So I'm kind of assuming that for those of you tuning in today, that you are kind of at that step where you know what an MSD is. It is maybe within your responsibilities at your workplace to address ergonomics. And maybe that's why you're tuning in. So that is what I'm going to assume. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on MSDs. But really, when you're conveying that to your frontline staff, it's explaining that you really want to explain that it's these specific types of injuries that ergonomics is targeting. That's important for their awareness. These are soft tissue injuries, and they can be called lots of different things, like strains and sprains. MSD is an umbrella term, and so many of them, you might want to give them some examples of what they may have heard. Tendinitis, carpal tunnel, golfer's elbow, tennis elbow, sciatica, all of those things, right? They're likely going to either know from experience or know a neighbor, a friend, a colleague, somebody where they've heard that and be like, yeah, and then they kind of relate. There are some different little activities. Sometimes what I have people do in a training session is do a little finger exercise. I might time them for 30 seconds and get them to make a fist, close and open it really, really fast for 30 seconds. And, usually that's enough time that if I ask you at the end of the 30 seconds, what kind of sensations were you feeling, that you kind of go around the room and everybody shares and they kind of come up with a variety of different things, right? Like, which would be very similar to symptoms of an MSD. Tightness, weakness, I felt some discomfort, I felt a little bit of burning, my muscles were getting tired. Some people might feel some tingling, it kind of depends on their own history as well. But, it's important that there are many different symptoms for a strain, a sprain for an MSD, and not everyone's going to experience them the same. Similarly, MSDs occur on a continuum. So in those early stages, you're going to want to use this opportunity to tell them, how an MSD develops. So it's not like, oh, I bent over, picked up that piece of paper, and I threw my back out. It wasn't that moment of bending over to pick up the piece of paper that caused the injury. It's likely years and years of chronic wear and tear on the body, lifting in awkward postures, sitting twisted, sitting slouched, those kinds of things that kind of built it up. And then that act, that bending over, picking up the piece of paper was literally the last straw. So in the early stages, it's usually this kind of symptoms or feelings that people will brush off, like, oh, I just slept funny last night. I got a kink in my neck, but I'll get a good night's sleep, it'll go away. Or it might be just when they're doing a very specific activity, and so they're able to kind of brush off, I don't have time to deal with this right now. And then as it progresses, maybe that discomfort has increased, it's lasting longer. Maybe it's not just during one task, maybe it's going on for several days at a time, and maybe they get relief when they go to a massage or a chiropractic appointment or taking an Advil. And then as it gets more severe, especially when you're using actual diagnosis terms like carpal tunnel or tennis elbow, that discomfort is likely now described as pain. Symptoms are usually more persistent. Maybe you're popping pain meds. And that's what you need to do all day, really, to get through the day. And sleep is being affected. Home and personal life is being affected because those symptoms are persisting beyond just working hours. So part of your base foundation for ergonomics training should cover off how MSDs occur to really highlight that they are chronic injuries. They can take years to develop. And so, it also could be a good opportunity here, or a reminder, and I mean, if you don't have this in place, then it's kind of a prompt for you as well, is, what's your company's policy for reporting injuries or near misses, right? We want to include these MSD risk factors and hazards as part of our near misses, right? That's an opportunity. If somebody has got some strain and sprain kind of discomfort symptoms, that's an opportunity to look at a job further and make some changes. So your frontline staff are going to be exposed to a variety of MSD hazards. I mean, it's super rare that a job has no hazards. And in the ergonomics world, these are what we call the big three. So force, posture, and repetition. And so I've got posture broken out into two there, so it looks like 4 bullet points. But really I'm talking about 3. Force, posture, repetition. Those are the big 3. And these hazards can be found to a certain degree in most job tasks. So part of your training to frontline staff will certainly need to provide some examples of these hazards. So for example, force could be represented as lifting, pushing, pulling, and you're going to want to highlight or get the staff asking some questions or explaining to you, some examples of things that they might lift, things that they push and pull to kind of come up with some of those hazards. Also, you should describe some awkward postures and how can they be harmful. So how does our body respond when we're working in an awkward posture? Is it as efficient? Is it as productive? Is it as strong? No. So we want to be able to identify what is an awkward posture and how that might be harmful to us. It could be bending forward, twisting, reaching overhead. And then similarly, also describing the effect of static postures on our body. So, this could be sitting or standing with minimal movement, gripping a power tool. All of those things you want to kind of get them thinking about, what are the hazards of their job? How can I apply my job to these 3 categories of force, posture, repetition? And also, it's a good opportunity too to clarify repetition. It's a really good one to review because so many people think that their job is repetitive, but and it likely is. But repetition is kind of, the exact definition is open to debate because what is repetitious to one joint is not necessarily repetitive to another joint. What's repetitive in one industry is not necessarily repetitive in another. If you go into a production facility, a manufacturing facility, and they have a cycle time where they are pumping out a part or a car or whatever once every 60 seconds, then yeah, the workers on the line, that's easy, right? We're not likely going to debate that that's not repetitive. We're likely to think of that as an example in our head of something that is repetitive. They do the same task over and over again every 60 seconds. But that's not to say that somebody else's job, just because they don't work in a manufacturing facility with a set cycle time like that, isn't repetitive. We could be talking about a field worker somebody who works out in parks and forestry, for example, and their job is to load the chipper. They're cleaning brush out of the ditch and loading the chipper. So maybe they are out there for an hour, 2 hours, and for that hour or 2 hours, they are repetitively loading the chipper with branches and brush. Right? So for that 1 and 2 hours, then we would say that yes, that is repetitive. They just may not do that exact same task all day, every day, but for that chunk of time, it is repetitive. So it's always good to kind of give some examples about what is repetitive, but you know, when I talk about repetition, I always want to make sure that staff understand the effects of combining hazards. So repetition on its own is not really a big red flag to me. It's more so when we are seeing hazards in combination, right? So if I just see a bad posture, if I just see something that's repetitive, you know, it's again not a really big red flag to me, but it's when I see something that's happening over and over again in a bad posture and using a high force or high force exertion, then that's a red flag. So we want to try to minimize hazards in combination. So remember, what we're always trying to get back to is like really to maximize engagement is using very specific and relevant examples. You want them to understand, how does ergonomics apply to me? So you can just talk high level about force, posture, and repetition, but really to kind of get it to hit home to them, you're going to want to talk about some specific examples of their job. And so as you kind of cover off your intro, so you're talking about what is ergonomics, what are MSD hazards, what are some of the hazards in my job, then kind of the next phase would be talking about some work methods or injury prevention strategies, right? And which could be work methods, it could be engineering controls, it could be administrative controls. So what are the things that they can do to help mitigate or reduce the risk of being exposed to those hazards? So this is really the part of the training that's going to need to vary depending on your group, or what I think should vary anyway. So it's going to depend on where they work. It's going to depend on what hazards they might be exposed to. And so work methods and controls that you would use are going to vary, you know, they're going to vary greatly depending on the task. The environment that they work in, you know, if we're talking about indoors at a computer workstation, are we talking about indoors on an assembly line? Are we talking about outdoors operating equipment? And so let's talk more about how to customize this aspect of the training. I think the principles up front is relatively standard, right? It's going to be almost cookie cutter in terms of how you might apply that to each of your different frontline staff. Mind you, you're going to use different examples to really hit home. And then this next section is going to be a lot more customized. And ways to kind of customize that, I mean, kind of just talking about how, I use the term cookie cutter, right, but you're still going to customize it, right? You know that when you explain ergonomics, when you explain the hazards, you're going to be using their examples. And so if this is something in the training that you're doing, maybe in a classroom, or you know, you're going to have some PowerPoint slides, then it's a really good idea to try to include some pictures, to include some videos. I mean, this is a good way, like let's say you're the one that's going out and doing the training, you're the health and safety manager, you're the HR manager, you know, whatever your role might be. How familiar are you with the hazards of all of your frontline staff? Do you know all of the jobs that they do and all of the tasks? So, you know, this is kind of a good education exercise for you as well. But when you're doing your training and trying to customize it, to go out onto the floor, to go out into the field and take some pictures, right? See what they're doing, and that's also going to help you to get that staff buy-in as well, right? They know that you're out there, that you're trying to learn about the job. You could even have them provide you some pictures, or, you know, have them pose or reenact the different tasks for you to use in the training. But, you know, I find that it's really helpful, especially if you do plan on doing any kind of training with a PowerPoint component. So if you give them an example of their own job tasks, and then you can kind of use that as a discussion point, or you could use it almost as like getting the group talking. You pose a couple questions, you get the group talking, and they start talking about the hazards of their job, and it's less about you telling them the hazards in their job and more about them sharing and kind of, you know, taking ownership and realizing that they do have some control over what they could do differently. So as an example, here's one where this would be an example that I might put up. So we would talk about what is ergonomics, we talk about MSD hazards, we would talk about some examples, and then we do a little practice session. So I'd put up a picture. So this is an example of somebody working in a maintenance shop in a garage, and they're doing a tire change. So what I might pose to the group then is, what are the force hazards that you see in this task? Get them to share, get them to talk about it. What are the posture hazards that you might see? What are the, do you see any, what are the awkward postures, bending? Is there any static postures that you see? What about repetition? Again, it's a picture, so maybe we're not necessarily seeing the repetition, but if they're talking about their own jobs, right, they're going to be able to picture this and be able to speak to that. You kind of get them talking about some of the hazards, and then ask, where might you see injury happening? What body parts do you think are at risk? And then what can we do about it? So is there another piece of equipment that could be used here? Is this person doing it in the quote-unquote best practice? So, is there a hoist available or something that could raise that car up higher? And that would improve the posture. Maybe there's a different tool that could be used. So like a cart, a dolly, a lift, something for the tire, right, to reduce the force hazard component. Is there something from a work method perspective that could be different? And often I find in this kind of this situation too, that when you get the group talking and sharing, that it really helps to kind of get them to help each other. So, tips and tricks that one person might have may not necessarily be something that their colleague was aware of, right? And be like, oh, that's a good idea, I'm going to try that. So I do find that when you include pictures and videos that, a picture can be worth 1,000 words. It's a really good kind of a point for creating discussion and, again, involving them, engaging them. Just to note that I do see that some questions have been asked. For today, I'm just going to try to, I'm going to try to do all the questions at the end of the session. So I'm not ignoring any questions that are coming through. I'm just going to use the time at the end to go through them all. Okay, so continuing on. So your general outline really, and what I suggest for your frontline staff training is to stick with talking about the core principles and then follow it with the workplace specific examples. So what is ergonomics? What are your MSDs? What are the MSD hazards specific to your job? What are some work methods and other controls or strategies that I could use, right? As the frontline worker, what is it that I could use? What could I do? And then think about how each of your groups of frontline staff may best receive the training. So this would be, thinking about what's most applicable for them, both from practicality of delivering the content and also for relevancy. So, how much time can you get from your staff? Is it going to be easy to get them for 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, a half day? And also, how much time do you have? So it's possible that some of your content, like some of that more theoretical components, could be delivered online or self-guided, right? Something that they could do on their own. That seems to be a pretty common route for many training topics these days. There's usually a ton of online modules that you have to go through when you start a new job, right, as part of your orientation. There seems to be a lot less face-to-face training. And then, even if I was talking about something, I'm going to use office ergonomics as kind of a more basic training. Like, yes, I think that doing online training for office ergonomics could be a successful option. But again, keeping in mind that we do so much training online that there can be value in trying to do it different. So as much as, you might give somebody the modules and they're sitting in front of their computer and you're teaching them how to adjust their computer workstation to fit them, how are they actually doing it? Is there opportunities for engagement for them to pause and say, yep, okay, I'm going to adjust my chair now? So, I mean, there's not really a guarantee in doing that, but PROergonomics, we're big on in-person training whenever possible. We really like to be able to show examples, to do demonstrations, to encourage discussion. So again, even when it is office ergonomics, if I was doing that session, I would always have an office chair available, or whatever I could get, even if there was like a mock workstation or something. And I would have somebody in the room, come up and sit in the chair, and kind of as a group, we would go through adjusting the chair, right? Show them all the levers on the chair, have everybody look at this person from the side and kind of comment on their posture. Does the chair need to go up or down or armrest, etc. So, I mean, a classroom style may be a practical for many of your training sessions, or maybe you can actually go out into the field, right? So that might be something else to consider. Like, are you going to bring everybody to you? So if you have a bunch of field workers, are you going to bring them to your main administration building, or your corporate office, head office, or are you going to go to them? Or do they have a training facility, that might be more practical? So things all to consider. in terms of, and it's all really going to vary in terms of what very specific content you want to get. If you're talking about the theoretical aspect, there's probably lots of options that are going to work. And if we're really trying to customize it and make it very workplace specific, then you're going to want to get a little creative and think about ways that you can go to them. How can you deliver the training to be as realistic and practical to them? So, what is best practice for frontline staff training? Actually, this was really an interesting discussion that we had recently. We held a pre-conference workshop earlier this month. This was a group of health and safety professionals from municipalities, and we were specifically talking about how to deliver ergonomic training to staff working in the field. So road staff, parks, waste collection, equipment operators, bus drivers, like anybody who was not, dedicated at a computer, basically. This was involving multiple staff, multiple locations, and so we could use an example here of driving ergonomics or work method training. And so, the discussion is, how should we deliver this type of training? How should we best deliver driving ergonomics training? And so we all agreed that really one-on-one training would be ideal, but not practical. It would be really hard, and probably impossible actually you'd have to have somebody's full-time job to do that. How would you possibly train 300 plus staff, however many are in your organization, on one-on-one training? Who knows how many topics you have to cover as well, let alone even 50 people. It's just not practical. So then would we ask all the staff to come to a classroom setting for training? And so we also agreed that that's not really practical for some of the topics that we'd want to cover. So that's not really going to be effective if we're wanting to talk about driving ergonomics, to bring everybody to a classroom and talk about ways that you can adjust your vehicle. It didn't really seem like the most practical or effective way to make that, for them to make that message really connect with them. And then sometimes it could be a challenge or time-consuming to get everyone to a central location. So ideally, we're thinking that whenever possible, the training should be done in their work environment, so that any examples that we would want to use, anything we want to demonstrate, it'd be more accessible. And so depending on your frontline staff and what they do, there might be different directions that your ergonomic training might want to go, kind of after you've covered off of that base, what is ergonomics, how does it apply to me? And so in last month's webinar, we talked a lot about job coaching, and although the intent was to talk about it specifically for return to work cases, we did talk a lot about job coaching and how it can be used effectively for staff training beyond just the return to work application. And so there's definitely a benefit to one-on-one coaching style of training, being able to give instructions that would be very customized, being able to answer the questions one-on-one, being able to give feedback. But realistically, it's not going to be practical for most of you when it comes to covering off all of your staff. Especially when the Ministry of Labor, for example, comes in and says that you need to have ergonomics training. Right? How are you possibly going to deliver that kind of training to everybody? So let's talk about some of the different ways that you might customize the ergonomics training. So beyond those general principles, what are some of the strategies or ideas to target your office-type customer service staff? Or what are some of the topics or strategies that you might do for delivering training to your staff working in the field? Those people who are operating heavy equipment, if they're working in roads, transportation, maintenance, parks, anything that's kind of out of the office. What is the best way to target them, and what are some of the topics that we might want to cover for them? So I'll start just with office ergonomics. It's kind of it is one that it applies in almost every workplace. You're going to have some of your frontline staff who do work at a computer primarily. And so I've seen this, there's lots of different ways that you could deliver office ergonomics training. Common to see it done online, or again, that self-guided way where you might watch a module, listen to a video, and the expectation is that you do some adjustments yourself. If you're looking for kind of a different way of doing it, something a little bit more engaging, a little more personable, you can look at doing, an in-person session. It could be a lunch and learn, for example. So have everybody gather around for that hour lunch break. Then we are talking about how to set up your computer workstation. Again, trying to provide some good examples, like by bringing in a chair, using the chairs that are in the boardroom and the table kind of as an example of a workstation and trying to see if that would fit them. I've heard of a couple organizations, kind of what they're starting to do is, incorporate an ergonomic assessment, an office ergonomic assessment of that workstation into the orientation. So as new staff come on board, then they kind of get a little bit of education, like, okay, here's your workstation, let's get it all set up for you. That is the one-on-one, but again, it's really only covering off the new people coming in, making sure that they've got all the equipment that they need to work in neutral or good postures. And then something that we've been involved with recently is in the wellness day sessions. So if your company does wellness day sessions, this could be a good opportunity too to cover off on office ergonomics in a different capacity for your office staff or staff working on computers. So if you've got different booths, for example, at your wellness day, maybe one of them could be this ergonomic station. Maybe you bring in one of the chairs that you have in your facility, and as staff are kind of walking through your wellness booth, they can stop, they can sit in the chair, they can learn how to do the different adjustment features. And an ergonomist or your Joint Health and Safety Committee member, somebody who is knowledgeable in educating them on that chair adjustment would be there. So in some cases it might be one-on-one, in some cases it'll be small groups. You could even have set demo time. Every 15 minutes we're going to do a little 5-minute demo. One of the wellness days that we did too, so we had a chair, and then they had also had, they were able to bring in a little desk with a keyboard tray. So a lot of staff had keyboard trays, so that was something else that they had there. They kind of had like a mock workstation, so you could come and sit, kind of learn some of the principles, try it out, and then go back to your own workstation and apply it. So those would be some interesting ways that you might be able to look at office ergonomics in a different way than just the traditional. So often it's just done online. Driving ergonomics. So this is an interesting one. When you're talking about your field staff, a lot of them are going to be driving vehicles, and it could be anything from, a car, an SUV, a van, to a forklift, to a backhoe, bigger vehicles like a grader, a dump truck, snowplow. So when you're talking about addressing ergonomics for those staff, we're talking about, how do we adjust their vehicle? So it's likely that their vehicle does several adjustments, the seating, and often what we find is that staff don't know all of the features or all of the adjustments that their seat can make. It's talking about adjusting the steering wheel, the monitors, the control panels that they look at. So knowing how to adjust them, and then also knowing what is kind of that best practice. And absolutely, I think that the best way to deliver this training is in the field, so being there. Again, coming to a classroom and learning how to adjust your forklift or how to adjust the backhoe, seating is not really going to be practical and effective. You're likely to get a bunch of eye rolls. But we've seen this quite successful out in the field, and it definitely works better when you do small group training. So you might want to think about how this might be best received. Is it you that's going to be delivering the training, or maybe you might think about doing a train the trainer method, right? So do you want the supervisor to be doing the training? So think about those frontline staff and who they might best receive that training from, right? Sometimes the supervisor is a good option, but sometimes it's more so like coming from a colleague or a peer, and it might be better received in that sense. And it's always good if you've got the resources to get some help in delivering this training. I think a train the trainer method could work quite well. Again, because you're trying to get people in, trying to make it hands-on, trying to make it interactive, you've got to have it in small groups so that everybody gets an opportunity to get into the vehicle and that you can all hear it. Like the cabs aren't that big. So something that we did recently actually was, again, another wellness day thing. And this was, I haven't seen it done too often, but I really liked this one in particular because they always have a wellness day, but this company in particular, their field staff said, oh, the wellness day is always for the administration staff. You forget about us out in the field. And so, they said, okay, great. What is it that you want? And so they incorporated a driving ergonomics component into their wellness day. So they had their field staff bring some of this is a picture from one of those training days actually. So they brought in some of their heavy equipment, a big dump truck. They brought in a grader. And then they also had some fleet vehicles. So I think there was a car and maybe a minivan. And so as part of the wellness day, staff from the field and from the office could rotate through to the different vehicles and get some education, in a small group on how to adjust the vehicle settings. And it was kind of a good way that everybody was really engaged, because even if you don't work in the field, they still had fleet vehicles there, and it was some education and some interesting tips that you could take back and use even in your personal vehicle. So this would be some interesting considerations for instructing or providing education on driving ergonomics. So going out to the field, trying to make that as applicable as possible. Manual material handling. So this is like your safe lifting training, and this is something that very often we say, yep, we provide safe lifting training, and it's so often it's kind of the typical lift with your knees, not with your back. Ears over toes, or ears over nose over toes, or ears over nose over hips over toes, right? Trying to keep everything in line. And you know what, those are some great principles, and absolutely we need to teach those. But if we're talking about trying to make this very specific for the frontline staff, it is likely rare that your staff are going to be lifting a perfectly shaped box like you're going to find in most diagrams. Right, any pictures that you use, any posters that you find, people are going to be, lifting a box with handles, nice and close to their body, big smile on their face, not sweaty. So what you're going to find is that if you deliver your safe lifting training in that style, and just using those kind of cookie cutter examples, I'll call it, you're not likely to get a super engaged workforce, right? So you say, oh, we provide safe lifting training, but people are still hurting their back. I still see terrible lifting techniques when I go out on the floor. It's like they didn't listen to what we did the training on, right? So I think that there's an opportunity to really enhance that style of training, make it more, like if you are going to do best practice, or if you are going to do manual material handling training in a classroom, for example, I would try to use pictures, examples, maybe even bring in some of the items that they specifically use to have them practice, right? So yes, go through your basic principles, again, that foundation on safe lifting techniques, but then say, okay, now this is what you have to lift, right? We're talking about lifting a reel of hose. We're talking about lifting a branch. We're talking about lifting a motor or a component, a piece of machinery. How would you do that? How would you apply those principles? How would you prepare for the lift, and how would you do it? And there could be, that might be an element or a way, of making it more specific for your frontline staff. You could do this in small groups. You could do it in a workshop style. Recently I did this with a group of custodial staff, and so it was a workshop style. So they kind of got that base education on what is ergonomics, how does it apply to me, and then we broke out into groups, and so they'd rotate to the different stations, and one of the stations was lifting, right? So safe lifting, and we had one station where they'd go through kind of the core principles of lifting, and then another station that would talk about moving furniture, and then another station that would talk about lifting garbage. And then we had another station that talked about mopping, so not lifting, but again, there was a lifting component within that because they would lift a mop bucket. So again, they'd start kind of with that core of lifting and then talk about how they might apply it in their actual real-life work scenarios. So when you're lifting a mop bucket, water sloshing around, how are you going to do that, right? There's not necessarily easy handles. Again, it's not a stable load. How could you make that easier for yourself? And this could be part of a wellness day thing. Again, we've done that kind of walking around to different jobs on the floor, watching people as they're working, kind of giving some coaching feedback, doing it, again, as a workshop style. Small groups is always good. Any way that you can get people involved and get them practicing is going to be likely better received, right, in terms of actually taking that information and then applying it in their own job and in their day-to-day routine. On a similar note, we could talk about safe patient handling. So if we're talking about kind of maybe in healthcare, maybe we're talking about paramedics or firefighting, safe patient handling, again, if you just talk about safe lifting principles, kind of in that traditional sense of, ears over your toes and lift with your knees, not with your back, you're likely to get a whole lot of eye rolling because these professions, these frontline staff are handling people. They don't have handles. They don't have boxes. They're not a square box. You're not able to, it doesn't seem as an obvious connection. Okay, great, that's how I would lift a box. Yep, I'm good with that. But how many of that patient who fell in the bathtub in this tiny little, basement apartment, how am I going to apply those techniques there? So for these types of groups, again, I think that having small groups and having case studies, I think that this is a really interesting way of applying that lifting training, the safe lifting training, to them, right? So again, it could be on wellness days, it could be their annual education day, right? Sometimes it can be tricky to get your healthcare staff together or your paramedic staff kind of all together in one group. And the timing can be tricky. So, doing some case studies, it's got to be, like, to do lifting training like really effectively, I think it needs to be hands-on, and I think it needs to be in person. I think there's the theory and maybe the theoretical components that could be covered maybe in a classroom style or maybe online, but to really get down to making it applicable to their work settings, lifting a patient in the stair chair up and down stairs, transferring a patient from a wheelchair to the bed using a lift assist, right? Like if we're talking about using a ceiling lift, a lot of those in healthcare, like and paramedics, all of them, they will have training that comes in from the lift companies, and they'll teach them how to use the stretcher, how to use the lift. But I think an element that's often missed is that ergonomics component, where we're really looking at the body postures. And so those are some tips and tricks that are really best done when you are doing it in a small group setting, when you do a case study. So you could have a group of 4 or 5 maybe, and you could have one of you pretend to be the patient, and you have 2 caregivers, and then maybe you have a spotter or the observer, the coach. And you can rotate through, have them practice that scenario a couple of different times, each of them taking on a different role. It's quite interesting to be the patient and kind of see it from that perspective, as well as to, be the observer and, giving feedback to your colleagues, your peers, and specifically looking at ergonomics, like using ergonomics language, so looking at the body postures. So those are some tips really, I think, for making safe lifting training more applicable when we're talking about patients, when we're talking about non-standard lifts. And then you might have, just in general, like you might have some best practices or work method training. So maybe we're not specifically talking about lifting, maybe we're not specifically talking about a computer. Like it's going to really vary with who your frontline staff are, right? So I put a couple of examples here of ones that I know that PROergonomics has been involved in recently. So I mentioned the janitor workshop that we did not too long ago, and so that's where they kind of went through the base education and then rotated to different stations where we really had some questions. We brought the work to them basically. So they all came to a training room. We were in a big boardroom, but we had the different stations set up. So we had a mop bucket and some mops in there. We had some bags of garbage and a garbage bin. We had some tables that they might have to move and set up. So as they rotated to the different stations, there were certain questions and kind of scenarios that they had to work through and problem solve. And again, it was really good in terms of sharing between colleagues. So, I would ask, well, how long should your mop handle be? And somebody would say, well, I cut mine because I'm short and I like it at this height. And I like it just below my chin. And I was like, great, that's exactly the answer. And then somebody else or colleague looks and says, oh, well, that's interesting. I never thought about doing that, but and then it makes sense. So it was a good opportunity for sharing about what are some of the best practices and what are the things that we can do to kind of help ourselves. Again, talking about in a lumberyard recently, and you're talking about how to handle, talking about not a box, right, a long piece of lumber, how to adjust a forklift. Similarly, this could be, working with some educational assistants. So in a classroom setting, maybe a teacher, and working with little kids, and they're sitting in those student-sized chairs, the little chairs, or sitting on the floor, and that is how you interact with kids. But what are some methods, what are some best practices that we might have from, getting up and down, or how to bend down to that posture to work with the kids. So for this type of training, a workshop style, small groups, that kind of thing, again, trying to build in some case studies or scenarios, I think, is a really effective way of trying to deliver that type of training, right? So specifically ergonomics, how does it apply to me? Here are some best practices, and it kind of really shows that you are talking specifically to them and trying to help them. As a recap, just kind of the session today is thinking about your goal. So are you looking at just giving that ergonomics 101? So what is ergonomics and kind of the high level? How does it apply to me? Or are you looking to really target some best practices and really provide almost more of a coaching style where you're talking very specifically about their job? So how to adjust the dump trucks that we drive, how to lift the pieces of lumber that we have here. Then that is going to change it'll change a little bit the content you're going to deliver. You're always going to have that general overview, that background, but it is going to change those specific examples. You're going to consider the setting and kind of that format that you're going to deliver the training to really maximize engagement for your staff, your frontline staff, right? They're the key to your business. So I'm going to take the time now just to answer a few questions. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to use that chat bar, and I will look over them right now. I'll read them out loud so that you guys can see them. So, okay, we've got two questions. I think they're about similar things. So it's in relation to when I was talking about repetition. So what is repetitive? So is typing repetitive or mouse clicking? We have a lot of staff complaining that that is repetitive. And so yes, I would say that typing and mousing can be a repetitive task. But I would warn you that I don't think that repetition is necessarily hazardous in this case, as long as we are minimizing other factors. So if you're in good posture, if your keyboard and your mouse are nicely aligned with your elbow height, you've got your shoulders relaxed, your elbows bent to about 90, your wrists are straight, you know, then I wouldn't say that typing repetitively is a hazard. But I would say that if you were in a bad posture, so if your keyboard was too high or too low or angled towards you and you're getting a bend in your wrist or, you know, a contact stress point to your wrist, then it's more so that we've got a combination of hazards here. We've got some bad postures or awkward postures combined with a repetitive task, and definitely that would be a hazard or a risk factor that I'd want to look at addressing. Okay, I have another question saying, can we receive an electronic copy of the presentation? I would love to share with my staff. So absolutely, what I will have is I've recorded this session, so everybody will get a link to the recording. And then I'm not going to send out the slides specifically, but if you have a specific request for the slides, then I'm happy to share them with you, so just send me a personal email. Okay, another question is, what would you recommend to do if the main task in a position is all about repetition, like manual automation? So, okay, this is similar actually to so this is a task where the main concern is repetition. And again, very similar to the mousing or the typing, my first thought is, are we sure that repetition is the big problem, right? Because repetition on its own is not a big red flag to me. What I would want to look at is the task as a whole. So what are the kinds of postures are they using? Are they doing a bad posture repetitively? Are they doing a high force exertion repetitively? A combination of the three? So just because something is repetitive doesn't always mean that it's a physical hazard. Sometimes it can be, you know, you might want to look at the repetition from I'm trying to think of the word, sorry, like a stimulation perspective, right? So it's boredom. You don't want to get errors. You want to make sure that you're still producing quality. So there's a couple of different things that I would look at, but I definitely say if you think that you're having injuries and it's just because of repetition, I would want you to look a little deeper to see if there's anything else going on, like some posture, some force, you know. And also I talked about those being the big three, but there are a couple other risk factors as well, like the temperature that you work in, whether or not there's contact stress. There are a couple other physical hazards that you might want to look at as well. Just force, posture, repetition, those are the big three. Okay, next question. I find that changing the work culture to one that focuses on the safety of the employees is quite hard. How can we overcome this? Great question. Okay, so this is going to take time. It's definitely not something that's going to take over. It's not going to happen overnight. You can talk about changing culture. I mean, you've got to start somewhere, and so by engaging your employees, getting their input, starting to address hazards or things that they bring up would all be good starting points. And again, it's just a matter of being consistent, and I would probably take on a participatory approach, right? So getting your staff involved, making them feel like their voice is heard, getting them to really be part of the solution. Even they can be involved in identifying the hazards, helping you identify the hazards and having them part of the solution as well. And those would all be starting points that I think would be really effective. I mean, you got to start somewhere in changing culture. It's not going to happen overnight, but you've got to start somewhere, and you have to be persistent and consistent. Okay, that looks to be about all the questions that I had that are posted. If you're like me and you get some questions that kind of pop up in your head after the fact, you can always call or email. That's the main email that's set up there, info@proergonomics.ca, or myself personally, you can always send me an email. I'll send you out an email after this session to let you know when the recording is available. So you'll have my direct contact information that way as well. It's snable@proergonomics.ca. And anytime, question, comment, feedback, anything like that, I always welcome the input. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just leave you with a little note about next month's webinar. I hope you can join us for that. The title is All in a Day's Work, Job Hazard Analyses. So my colleague Alex is going to be presenting this one, and that's in July 18th. And this will be a little bit of a different focus. So we talk a lot about ergonomics topics, and this is something that is a little bit more of a safety focus and definitely kind of falls under the safety, more so under the safety umbrella as opposed to directly under ergonomics. But Alex has been doing a lot of JHAs lately, and so this would be a good way of kind of reviewing that. If it's something that you've kind of got on your plate, if you're doing them right now, or you know you need to get to them or update them, this might be a good webinar for you to tune into. So hopefully you can register for that, and we'll see you at some future webinars. Again, thank you everybody for joining in today, and we'll talk to you again soon. Have a good afternoon.